Back in the 1970s, hitchhiking was a common method of traveling. If you needed to get from point A to point B, no matter how far that may be, you could start walking along the road, stick out your thumb, and in a matter of no time, you would have a ride to help you along the way. It was fairly common and relatively safe. Relatively. For one young girl who had hitchhiked many times in the past, was tired of the tension at home, and was ready to set out on the road to get away from her home life. She had no idea that it would change her forever, or that what happened to her would be a story to warn others about what could happen if you went hitchhiking. This episode contains rape, torture, and violence against a minor, as well as murder. Viewer discretion is advised. Mary Belle Vincent was born in 1963 in Las Vegas, Nevada, and she lived there with her father, Herb, who repaired slot machines, and her mother, Lucy, who worked for a casino as a blackjack dealer. Mary was the middle child of 7 children and had a promising future as a dancer. She performed in places like Australia and Hawaii, and even at the Lido de Paris in Las Vegas, which was the best show in Vegas at the time. Mary's parents were kind of strict, and when she was 14, she ran away from home to go live with her boyfriend. And the couple lived out of his car for a short time, but her boyfriend was soon arrested for rape of another girl. So Mary was on her own and knew it was time to leave. On September 29, 1978, Mary left Berkeley, California to either head south 400 miles to her grandfather's house in Corona, California, or back home to Las Vegas. Either way, Mary knew that she needed to head south, and she did what she normally would do when she needed to get somewhere that she wanted to go, and that was to hitchhike. So she stood along the highway in an area where a lot of other hitchhikers would typically stand, and she stood there holding a sign that said "Going South." There were a few other people actually standing on the side of the road behind Mary holding similar signs. That's when a man pulled up driving a blue minivan. There were no other people inside of the van. So Mary ran up to the van and said she was heading south and if he could give her a ride. He said yes, but there was only room for one person. So Mary goes back and gets her bag, and the other people standing there said, it's not a good idea to get in a van with a man that says there are no other room except for one person, and that person happens to be a young girl. Mary ignored those warnings because she was desperate to get home. She was so tired of living on the streets and scrounging for food that she just wanted to get home, and it didn't matter how she got there. In her mind, she says the man looked like a grandfather type of a person, so she got into the van thinking that it couldn't be that bad. She did notice the man was drinking a clear liquid out of a milk jug, but she didn't know what it was. When she sat down in the van, she lit a cigarette, and the smoke made her sneeze. The driver asked her if she was feeling okay and checked her temperature by touching her neck. This made Mary flinch, and she pulled away. The driver apologized and just said, I'm sorry, it won't happen again. I was just making sure that you felt okay. Mary then felt a little bit more comfortable. So the van drove off, and since Mary was feeling a little more comfortable, she dozed off in the passenger seat. When Mary woke up, though, she noticed that the road signs were going in the opposite direction. They were going north instead of south. That immediately made her nervous, which it would make anyone nervous. So she grabbed a stick that she found in the van and she used it to threaten the driver. The driver apologized again and said he's just an old man. He didn't mean to make a mistake. He thought he was going south and he just didn't realize which way he was going. So he turned around the van and they started heading south. As they drove down the road, Mary still felt uneasy. Even though the man didn't seem dangerous, he was very apologetic and polite, but she still didn't feel right. A little while later, the man pulled over on the side of the road to go to the bathroom, and Mary decided to get out and stretch her legs while still feeling nervous. As he was in the bushes urinating, Mary thought to herself, if I need to run, I can run away. But then, as she thought that, she noticed that her shoelaces were untied. So she decided, I'm just going to bend over really quick and tie my shoes. While she was doing that, the driver went around to the back of his van to his toolbox and grabbed something. He then came up behind Mary really quick and hit her over the head with a sledgehammer. The driver was 50-year-old Lawrence Singleton. Not much is known about Singleton's background or upbringing, but he was born July 28, 1927 in Tampa, Florida. He dropped out of school when he was 16 and worked for the railroad and then at a shipyard for a year. He then went on to maritime school and joined the Merchant Marines and went to sea. At age 17, he was sent to sea for the first time, and in 1950, he was drafted to the Army and served in the Korean War. He was honorably discharged in 1952, but I wasn't able to find the reason why. He had 2 failed marriages and was a severe alcoholic, or what you would call a mean drunk. He married a woman named Shirley in 1958, and they had a daughter, Deborah, in 1963. He did not have a good relationship with Deborah at all. In fact, she was afraid of her father. Shirley did pass away in 1977, and he retired and resided in Western Nevada. That was the only information that I could find on Lawrence Singleton, and those were from some court documents. So like I said, that's all I could find on Lawrence Singleton prior to 1978, and that includes 0 criminal activity. When Mary regained consciousness, she was bound in the back of Singleton's van, where he forced her to drink what Mary assumed was alcohol from that plastic jug she saw Lawrence drinking from earlier. Then he raped and sodomized her several times in the van over the course of the next 3 days on the side of the road. After this, though, Lawrence Singleton was not finished with Mary. In his mind, he was going to kill her and dispose of her. Then Lawrence got into the driver's seat of his van, leaving Mary still bound in the back of his van, and he started to drive towards the Del Puerto Canyon. Once he got there, he pulled off to the side of the road, and he pulled Mary out of the van, laying her on her back. He then kneeled down beside her and said, "You want to be set free? I'll set you free." He then pulls out an axe from the back of his van and chops at her left arm with one swing. He had cut her left arm below the elbow, and it made Mary stumble back. But she was confused because she was just holding on to Lawrence's arms. Then with Mary's right arm, it didn't quite happen the same. Mary stated that Lawrence had hit her arm 3 times with the axe before it was cut off. But her right hand was still holding on to Lawrence's arm. And Mary stated that Lawrence had to shake his arm because her hand was still hanging onto his arm and he couldn't get it off of his arm. He then picked up Mary and threw her down a 30-foot cliff. Now, I was under the impression when I first heard this story several years ago that Lawrence just threw her over an embankment. But 30 feet is so much farther down than you think when you picture it in your mind. From Lawrence throwing her down a 30-foot cliff, Mary had broken 4 ribs. Then Lawrence made his way down the cliff to conceal Mary's body because in his mind, she was dead or very close to death. Lawrence then took Mary and shoved her in a concrete pipe and then said as he was walking away, "Okay, now you're free." He then went back up to his van and drove away, and he thought he had gotten away with rape and murder. And that is why Lawrence had cut off her arms so that the police couldn't identify her. This was his justification in his mind for mutilating Mary. Something tells me, though, that this isn't the first time Lawrence Singleton raped and attempted to murder somebody, or just flat out murder somebody. As someone who has studied criminals and the crimes that they commit, it is very rare for someone in their 50s to just start picking up young girls, and I'm sorry, she's a child, rape, mutilate, and attempt to murder her. I think he's done this many times. He just got a little sloppy about it. As Mary laid in the concrete pipe, bleeding profusely, she was naked and very cold. She kept telling herself not to fall asleep. No matter what you do not fall asleep. Mary was able to muster the strength to get herself out of that pipe. I'm not sure that I could do what Mary did or even have the mental clarity to get out of the pipe, but Mary's will to live was heroic. Mary got herself out of the pipe and knew that she had to do something about the bleeding or she wouldn't survive. She took her arms and shoved them in the dirt to create a barrier to try to stop the bleeding. The blood in the dirt created a muddy-like paste at the end of her arms, and this stopped the bleeding. Like I said, I don't know that after getting clubbed in the head with a sledgehammer, getting raped, mutilated, and thrown down a cliff, I would be able to gather the thoughts to even do any of this. Mary then got herself up the cliff and remembered when she was a child that when she would cut her finger to hold it up in the air to stop it from bleeding. So she raised her arms upward and kept her arms from bleeding anymore and to keep the muscles from falling out of her arms. Mary then walked 3 miles down a deserted road barefoot to reach a main road in hopes of flagging someone down. The first car that came upon Mary saw an awful sight, and it scared them so much that they turned their car back around and went the way they came. If I'm honest, this would have scared me too. The next car came along and stopped to help. They helped Mary into the truck, wrapped her in towels, and drove to the nearest phone at a small airport to call for help. Mary was taken to a hospital where she could only say one thing: "He raped me." She had lost over half of her body's blood, and the doctors told her that the remaining portion of the blood that still was inside of her body was turning toxic. The doctors then took some muscle tissue out of Mary's leg to put back into her arms, making her leg considerably weaker. Mary's dreams of dancing were over. Mary worked with a police sketch artist and gave an incredibly accurate description of Lawrence Singleton. Police released the sketch to the media, and right away Lawrence's neighbor called the police and said he believed that the sketch was his neighbor. Lawrence was arrested for the rape and attempted murder of Mary. Before I continue with this part of the story, I want to stress that in the 1970s, rape was not looked at as a severe accusation or charge like it is today. I am not sure why being charged for rape was a little more than a slap on the wrist back then, but it was. So once Lawrence was arrested and the questioning began, he stated that Mary was a $10 a night prostitute that threatened him. He stated that Mary would report to the police that he had raped her if she didn't get a ride from him to LA. Do you know what Lawrence's explanation was for the mutilation of Mary? And this is just unbelievable. He said that he didn't just pick up Mary at the same time, he also picked up two men named Pedro and Larry. Lawrence claimed that it was Pedro and Larry that raped her and chopped her arms off. Once in court, Mary gave a strong testimony. With her testimony and items belonging to Mary that were found in Lawrence's house was strong enough to find Lawrence guilty. When Mary got off the stand, she walked past Lawrence to return to her seat, and he whispered to her, "I'll finish the job if it takes me the rest of my life." Mary ran out of the courtroom because of this. No one apparently heard him intimidating the witness in court because nothing happened because of that remark. Lawrence was found guilty of forcible rape, sodomy, forced oral copulation, kidnapping, mayhem, and attempted murder. I didn't know what mayhem was, so I wanted to read to you what mayhem is defined as. It means to maim, requires a general intent to maim or cause bodily harm, accompanied by an unlawful act of physical force that either permanently dismembers the victim or disabled the use of some part of their body. Lawrence was sentenced to 14 years in prison, 10 years for the attempted murder, and only 4 years for the rape and sodomy. His sentencing for the kidnapping was stayed based on the completion of his sentence for the previous charges. So if he had completed his sentence for the attempted murder and the rape, then he wouldn't have to serve any more for the kidnapping, which is just crazy to me. The judge in this case stated that he wished he could have sentenced him to life in prison, but based on the California law at the time, he could not. A rape charge in California only carried the punishment of 1 year and 3 months. Lawrence was released after only 8 years served because of good behavior. After the trial, Mary went to school for handicapped children to help learn how to work with her prosthetic arms. Mary didn't look at herself as a survivor. She suffered from depression, nightmares, and PTSD. Because of all that, she was unable to find a job. Once Lauren got out of prison, Mary filed a civil suit against Lawrence and won for the amount of $2.56 million. Mary also went into hiding. Someone who also went into hiding upon Lawrence's release was his daughter. She was terrified of him and begged them not to release him, explaining how dangerous he was. Authorities told her the most that she could do was get a restraining order, but she didn't. She felt she was safer without it. When you file a restraining order, the person that the restraining order is against knows your address, and she thought if she didn't file one, he wouldn't know where she's at. Now, the next part of this story is so unbelievable, it just pisses me off. Once Lauren was out on parole, he tried to sue Mary. He claimed that he was forcibly kidnapped for the purposes of robbery. Lawrence said that Mary threatened the rape charges, so in his mind that was kidnapping, and then since Mary supposedly demanded a ride, in his mind that was robbery. I do not know how he was paroled. He didn't show an admission of guilt or zero remorse. And I always thought, from what I've seen a million times in the past, in order to get paroled, you have to show remorse. You have to show an admission of guilt. And from him trying to sue her and with these accusations, shows zero remorse. But thankfully, that went absolutely nowhere. But it just shows the audacity and so far out of touch with reality that this man is. So once Lawrence was on parole, wherever he lived, he was met with hundreds of protesters outside of his residences yelling at him to get out of their town. And this happened several times. He would move because of the treatment he would receive from the locals, and it kept happening again and again. One time, the protest outside his apartment was so volatile that the police had to come and escort him out of town in a bulletproof vest. Then the governor of California ordered him to stay on the grounds of the San Quentin prison in a small trailer to serve out the remainder of his parole. Once his parole was complete, Lawrence moved back to Florida. Once in Florida in the 1990s, Lawrence committed a few petty crimes. One time he stole a $10 disposable camera and was sentenced to 60 days in jail. Another time, in that same year, he stole a $3 hat from Walmart and was sentenced to 2 years in jail, but was released early. Then on February 19, 1997, Lawrence paid $20 for a prostitute named Roxanne Hayes to come to his apartment. Roxanne was a 31-year-old devoted mother to 3 children who was described as bright and witty. During her time there, a painter walked through the front door into the apartment and saw what appeared to be a naked man strangling a woman laying on the couch who was calling out for help. The sight alarmed the painter and he backed out the way he came in and he left, but he called 911. The police arrived right away. Lawrence answered the door, naked and covered in blood. Lying on the couch was Roxanne, and she was dead from over a dozen stab wounds. Lawrence was taken into custody and said that he was only defending himself, that Roxanne was trying to rob him. Lawrence went to trial, and his defense counsel filed a motion to exclude evidence from Singleton's prior violent felonies and also filed a motion to exclude any testimony made by Mary Vincent, but the court thankfully denied these motions. The defense counsel moved to have the court direct Mary Vincent to keep her prosthetic limbs below the level of the witness stand so that the jury would not be able to look at them during her testimony. And the court denied these motions. It's just unreal from his defense. So Mary then traveled from California, where she lived, to Tampa, Florida, to testify in the trial, and her testimony helped with the conviction of Lawrence Singleton. Lawrence was sentenced to death for the murder of Roxanne Hayes, but he died of cancer at the age of 74 in the year 2001. It was only then that Mary felt safe again, and Lawrence's daughter actually came out of hiding. Mary said on the show, "I survived. I needed to know what was in that dark soul of his. I felt I was robbed of that opportunity, but because of my sons, I saw the relief in their faces, and that made me realize, okay, that's good enough closure for me. I don't have to worry about my sons' lives anymore." Mary now never refers to Lawrence by his name to this day. She only refers to Lawrence as my attacker. Mary is now married with 2 adult sons and a parrot and is an amazing artist. Mary also said in the show I Survived, she said, "I never knew that there could be people like that in the world, and I pray to God I never know another."